He moved quietly between the rows, trimming grass, sweeping leaves, resetting tilted flags. Every grave was spotless, every corner cared for. Visitors nodded politely, assuming he was just the groundskeeper. No one asked his name. No one ever stayed long enough to wonder. Then one day, as he brushed the dust from a headstone, the haunting sound of a bugle broke the silence. A funeral had begun nearby. Standard honors, folded flag, quiet sobs. He stood still, hand over heart, eyes downcast like always. Just a bystander, or so everyone thought. But something changed. A soldier stepped forward, holding something. Old, worn, precious. These were found in his shed, the family whispered. Bronze stars, purple hearts, a name etched in fading metal. The crowd turned. Eyes widened. The man with the rake wasn't just a caretaker. He had served, fought, bled, and for years, in silence, he honored his fallen brothers without asking for anything. That day, as the flag was placed in his lap and a salute was offered to him, the truth finally rose from the silence. He belonged among the honored dead. Welcome to Silent Salute. Before we continue with this story that will change how you see the quiet heroes around us, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today? And if you think stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support our channel. We're growing every day, and your support means everything to us. Arlington National Cemetery stretched across rolling hills like a vast garden of memory, where white headstones stood in perfect rows marking the final resting places of America's heroes. The morning mist clung to the grass as the first rays of sunlight broke through the ancient oak trees, casting long shadows between the graves. It was here among the honored dead that Thomas Mackenzie had worked for the past 15 years, maintaining the sacred ground with a dedication that bordered on reverence. Thomas arrived each morning before dawn, his weathered pickup truck pulling into the maintenance area as the sky began to lighten. He was a quiet man in his 70s with silver hair and calloused hands who approached his work with the kind of precision that suggested military training. Though he never spoke about his past, his uniform was simple work clothes and boots that had seen countless miles of walking between the graves, but everything about his bearing suggested respect for the place and the people buried there. The other groundskeepers respected Thomas, but didn't know much about him. He kept to himself during breaks, ate his lunch alone under a tree near the tomb of the unknowns, and never joined the casual conversations that filled the maintenance shed at the end of each day. When newcomers asked about his background, he would simply say he'd been taking care of the cemetery for a long time and changed the subject. His work spoke for itself. Every section he maintained was immaculate, every headstone under his care was perfectly clean, every flag was positioned with mathematical precision. Visitors to the cemetery often noticed the difference between sections Thomas maintained and those cared for by other groundskeepers. His areas had an extra level of attention that went beyond basic maintenance. The grass was trimmed with artistic precision, the flowers were arranged with careful consideration for color and meaning. Even the walkways seemed to have been swept with special care. Families who came to visit their loved ones often commented on how beautiful and respectful the grounds appeared, though they never knew who was responsible. Thomas had developed routines over the years that went far beyond his official duties. He knew the location of every grave in his sections and had memorized the stories behind many of the headstones. He would spend extra time cleaning the markers of soldiers who rarely received visitors, making sure their memory was preserved. Even when no family members came to pay respects during holidays, he would place small flags or flowers on graves that otherwise went undecorated, ensuring that no fallen hero was forgotten. The cemetery administration appreciated Thomas's dedication, but never questioned his methods. They assumed he was simply a conscientious employee who took pride in his work. His personnel file was thin, containing only basic employment information and emergency contacts, but no detailed background or military service records. He had passed all required security checks, and his work was exemplary, so no one felt the need to dig deeper into his history. Other employees sometimes wondered about Thomas's extensive knowledge of military history and protocol. He could identify unit insignia on headstones, explain the significance of various medals and honors, and seemed to understand the proper procedures for military funerals with the expertise of someone who had experienced them firsthand. When honor guard ceremonies took place, he would always stop his work and stand at attention until the final notes of taps faded away, but he never explained his obvious familiarity with military customs. On this particular October morning, Thomas was working in Section 60, where many recent casualties from Iraq and Afghanistan were buried. The headstones here were newer, the marble whiter, and the grief of visiting families more raw than in other parts of the cemetery. He approached this section with special reverence, knowing that these graves represented the most recent sacrifices in America's ongoing conflicts. The families who visited here were often younger parents who had lost children or spouses who had lost partners far too early. As Thomas carefully cleaned a headstone belonging to Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, who had died in Afghanistan 3 years earlier, he noticed a family approaching from the main road. A woman in her 50s walked beside a man of similar age, followed by 2 teenagers and an elderly woman using a walker. They moved slowly, their faces bearing the weight of loss that never fully goes away. They were clearly heading for Sergeant Rodriguez's grave, which Thomas had just finished maintaining. The family was the Rodriguez family, making their monthly pilgrimage to visit their son and brother Michael's grave. They had driven 3 hours from Pennsylvania and always came on the anniversary of significant dates: his birthday, the day he enlisted, the day he died. These visits were both painful and necessary, a way of maintaining connection with the young man who had died serving his country in a war that seemed very far away from their suburban life. Maria Rodriguez, Michael's mother, carried a small bouquet of carnations while her husband Carlos held a folded American flag that had been presented to them at the funeral. The teenagers Emma and Diego were Michael's younger siblings who had grown from children to young adults in the years since his death, but still struggled to understand why their brother had to die so far from home. The elderly woman Rosa was Michael's grandmother, who had raised him after his parents divorced and remarried later in life. As the family approached the grave, Thomas stepped back respectfully, allowing them privacy for their visit. He had seen thousands of such moments over the years and understood the importance of giving families space to grieve and remember, but something about this particular family caught his attention, perhaps because he had been caring for Michael's grave with special attention, or perhaps because their grief seemed so genuine and profound. The Rodriguez family knelt beside the headstone, placing the flowers and speaking quietly in both English and Spanish. Maria touched the marble surface, while Carlos stood with his hand on his wife's shoulder. The teenagers remained standing, uncertain how to process their emotions in this sacred space. Rosa, the grandmother, moved closer to the headstone and began speaking in rapid Spanish, her voice carrying decades of love and loss. Thomas continued his work in the nearby area, trying to give the family privacy while remaining close enough to ensure their security and comfort. He had developed an instinct for recognizing families who might need assistance or support, and something about this group suggested they were carrying more than just the normal burden of grief. There was an intensity to their sorrow that suggested unresolved questions or incomplete understanding. After several minutes of quiet conversation among themselves, Maria Rodriguez stood and looked around as if searching for someone. She walked over to where Thomas was working and asked if he had been the one maintaining Michael's grave. Thomas nodded modestly, explaining that he was responsible for this section of the cemetery and took pride in caring for all the heroes buried here. Maria's eyes filled with tears as she thanked him for keeping her son's memory so beautifully preserved. The conversation that followed revealed the family's struggle to understand Michael's service and sacrifice. They had received his personal effects from the military, but many questions remained unanswered about his final mission and the circumstances of his death. The official reports were classified, and the family had been left to piece together their own understanding of why their son had died and what his service had meant to his country. Thomas listened with the patient attention of someone who understood both military service and family grief. As the family prepared to leave, Maria asked if Thomas had served in the military himself. He paused for a moment, looking out across the rows of white headstones before answering quietly that he had served a long time ago in conflicts that most people preferred to forget. His response was humble, but carried the weight of experience that comes from understanding sacrifice firsthand. As the Rodriguez family drove away, Thomas returned to his work, but found himself thinking about their visit and their questions about Michael's service and the classified nature of his final mission, about families left to wonder about the meaning of their losses, about the distance between official reports and the human cost of war. He had seen too many such families over the years and understood their need for answers that sometimes never came. The following week brought an unexpected development. A military vehicle pulled into the cemetery's administrative area, and several officers in dress uniforms requested a meeting with the cemetery director. The meeting was brief, but significant, resulting in a phone call to Thomas asking him to report to the main office immediately. Thomas had never been summoned to the administrative building before and wondered if there had been some problem with his work or if budget cuts were affecting his position. When Thomas arrived at the office, he found not only the cemetery director, but also Colonel Patricia Williamson from the Pentagon and Master Sergeant James Crawford, who appeared to be involved in some kind of special assignment. The atmosphere was formal, but not hostile, suggesting this was an official inquiry rather than a disciplinary action. Thomas stood at attention instinctively despite being in civilian clothes, waiting for someone to explain the purpose of the meeting. Colonel Williamson began by asking Thomas about his background and service record. When he hesitated to provide details, she explained that they had been conducting a routine security review and discovered some discrepancies in personnel files. The review had been triggered by the Rodriguez family's inquiry about their son's classified mission, which had led to questions about who had access to information about the soldiers buried in Section 60. What emerged during the conversation was extraordinary. Thomas Mackenzie was not just a groundskeeper with military experience. He was Thomas Mackenzie, former lieutenant colonel in Army Special Operations, who had served in some of the most classified missions of the past 3 decades. His personnel file at the cemetery was incomplete because his actual service record was buried under layers of security classifications that few people had clearance to access. The reason for the current inquiry was that Michael Rodriguez had been part of a special operations unit that Thomas had commanded during his final years of active duty. The classified mission that had resulted in Michael's death was one that Thomas knew intimately because he had planned and supervised it. The family's questions about their son's service had inadvertently uncovered the fact that the man who had been caring for Michael's grave was the same man who had sent him on his final mission. Colonel Williamson explained that Thomas's identity had been protected for security reasons related to ongoing classified operations and the sensitivity of his former assignments. His work at Arlington was partly a form of witness protection and partly a way of allowing him to continue serving his country in a different capacity. Many of the soldiers buried in his sections had served under his command or in operations he had planned, and his dedication to maintaining their graves was both professional duty and personal responsibility. The conversation continued for over an hour, covering aspects of Thomas's service that had never been publicly acknowledged. His record included decorations for valor, leadership, and sacrifice that placed him among the most distinguished soldiers of his generation, but his assignments had required him to remain anonymous to avoid compromising ongoing operations or endangering other personnel who had served under his command. As the meeting concluded, Colonel Williamson asked Thomas if he would be willing to meet with the Rodriguez family to provide them with the answers they sought about their son's service. The mission details would remain classified, but Thomas could help them understand the importance of Michael's sacrifice and the courage he had shown in his final moments. Thomas agreed, immediately understanding that this conversation was long overdue and necessary for the family's healing. The meeting was arranged for the following week at Michael's gravesite, with Colonel Williamson present to ensure that security protocols were observed. The Rodriguez family arrived not knowing what to expect, having been told only that someone with knowledge of Michael's service wanted to speak with them. When they saw Thomas waiting beside the headstone, they initially assumed he was there in his capacity as groundskeeper. Thomas introduced himself using his military rank and explained his connection to their son's service. The revelation was overwhelming for the family, who suddenly understood that the man who had been caring for Michael's grave with such dedication was the same person who had known him as a soldier and leader. The conversation that followed provided the answers they had been seeking for years. Thomas spoke about Michael's courage, his dedication to his fellow soldiers, and the critical importance of the mission that had cost him his life. He explained that Michael had volunteered for the assignment, understanding the risks, and had performed with exceptional bravery under impossible conditions. The mission had saved countless lives and advanced critical strategic objectives, but the details would remain classified to protect ongoing operations. As Thomas finished speaking about Michael's service, he reached into his jacket and withdrew a small box containing his own decorations from the mission that had taken Michael's life, including the Silver Star he had been awarded for leadership under fire and the Purple Heart he had received for wounds sustained while trying to save Michael and other members of the team. He handed the box to Maria Rodriguez, explaining that these belonged with Michael now because they represented shared sacrifice and shared honor. The gesture was unexpected and profound. Maria Rodriguez held the box of medals while tears streamed down her face, finally understanding not only her son's heroism, but also the depth of respect and remembrance that had been shown to him by the man who had commanded him. Thomas explained that caring for Michael's grave had been both his duty and his privilege, a way of ensuring that his sacrifice was never forgotten or diminished. Colonel Williamson then announced that arrangements had been made for a formal ceremony to honor both Michael's service and Thomas's dedication. A military honor guard would present a flag ceremony at Michael's grave, and Thomas would be formally recognized for his years of faithful service to the memory of fallen soldiers. The ceremony would be private, attended only by the Rodriguez family and a small group of military personnel who understood the significance of what had taken place. The ceremony took place on a crisp November morning with an honor guard detail presenting arms while a bugler played taps across the silent cemetery. The flag was folded with precise military protocol and presented not only to the Rodriguez family, but also to Thomas in recognition of his service both as a soldier and as a guardian of memory. The moment was both an ending and a beginning, closure for a family's questions, and recognition for a hero who had served in silence. As the ceremony concluded and the family prepared to leave, Maria Rodriguez approached Thomas one final time. She thanked him not only for providing answers about Michael's service, but also for the years of loving care he had given to her son's final resting place. She understood now that his attention to Michael's grave had been more than professional duty. It had been a form of honor guard that continued long after the funeral ended. Thomas remained at the grave after everyone else had left, standing at attention in his civilian clothes one final time before returning to his work. The ceremony had changed his relationship with the cemetery, but not his dedication to maintaining it. He would continue caring for the graves of fallen soldiers, but now with the recognition that his service extended far beyond groundskeeping into the realm of memory, guardianship, and honor preservation. In the months that followed, the story of Thomas Mackenzie became known throughout the veteran community as an example of service that transcends official duty. His work at Arlington took on new meaning as people understood that many of the graves he maintained were those of soldiers he had known personally, commanded, or served alongside. His dedication was no longer seen as simply conscientious employment, but as a form of ongoing military service. The Rodriguez family continued their monthly visits to Michael's grave, but now with a deeper understanding of his sacrifice and the community of honor that surrounded his memory. They began volunteering at veteran organizations and sharing Michael's story as a way of ensuring that his service inspired others. Thomas would always make sure to be visible during their visits, not intruding on their private time, but remaining available if they needed anything. Sometimes the most profound service happens in silence, performed by people who seek no recognition or reward. Thomas Mackenzie had spent 15 years caring for the graves of America's heroes, while carrying the weight of his own classified service and the memory of soldiers who had died under his command. His story became a reminder that honor takes many forms, and that sometimes the most important recognition comes not from medals or ceremonies, but from the simple act of remembering. This story was brought to you by Silent Salute. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition, but deserved more than anyone else? Tell us in the comments what they meant to you and how you remember them. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.